slay, Kull, rasped the Pict's voice. They be all serpent men. The rest was a scarlet maze. Kull saw the familiar faces dim like fading fog, and in their places gaped horrid reptilian visages as the whole band rushed forward. His mind was dazed, but his giant body faltered not. The singing of his sword filled the room, and the onrushing flood broke in a red wave. But they surged forward again, seemingly willing to fling their lives away in order to drag down the king. Hideous jaws gaped at him, terrible eyes blazed into his unblinking. A frightful, fetid scent pervaded the atmosphere. The serpent scent that Kull had known in the southern jungles. Long live King Kull, dear readers. Welcome to another episode of Roll of Attention with the terrific triumvirate of XJ, Robert Gibson, and I, Nikita Zuev, delve deep into the vaults of humanity's archives of fictional treasures. Robert E. Howard is again the topic of our discussion, this time with what many call the first true sword and sorcery tale, the Shadow Kingdom. The first story depicting our famed king, the Shadow Kingdom, follows Kull of Atlantis and his escapades as the ruler of Valusia. Fighting conspiracies, making pacts with Pictish tribes, going undercover and rooting out the evil serpent men from his domain. This work also shows us how Brule became the trustworthy advisor of Kull, as well as diving deeply into the lore of the pre-Hyborian age. Just like the previous works we reviewed by Robert E. Howard, a significant amount of time is spent describing the environments, painting skirmishes with the signature grit of Mr. Howard, and portraying magic as terrifying and elusive. A great tale, in my opinion at least, but I will share a little bit more of that later. For now, I wish to hear a little bit more from Robert. Robert, what do you have to say about the Shadow Kingdom?
It was the first Kull story I read, I think, and it was a good
It
one
was
to
also the
start
first.
with.
It was also the first Kull story ever published.
Yeah, yeah. So I started in the right place, and I never forgot. Although this was a long, long time ago, I never forgot the image of suddenly, as it were, waking from a hypnotic trance and realizing that a lot of the people around one are not human at all. They just have the illusion of being human. And this is done very well in the story. I can't fault it at all. The only thing I might say, on very general terms, is that this is one of those examples where you're meant to think that snakes there's something horrible about snakes, and I don't. I don't mind snakes at all. But still,
Mm.
that's a long tradition in horrors to think that there's something. I suppose they are a bit sinister in a way, but
It
I
may
don't know.
come from the biblical situation with the snake, the
Yeah,
serpent,
yeah.
providing the access to for humanity to fall.
True, true. I suppose they've had a bad press since then. But
Yeah.
anyway, it's a great story, and I would say, I suppose, if you look into it minutely, you might come to the conclusion that some of the scenes are just a little bit repetitive, but I would not go in for that. I would say that where in the palace, Cull and Brule go to and fro and to and fro, trying to make sure of things. That's very realistic because they really don't know whom to trust. So I would struggle to find anything wrong with this story. Actually,
Yeah. All
Hmm.
right. Uh, what about you, actually? How did you feel? What was your first impression of the Shadow King?
I think it's a very interesting historical sort of a historical read at a very, very early Sword and Sorcery short story and the kind of template it sets for things that follow, because you can very clearly see that this is the prototype for Conan. It mirrors a lot of the dichotomy that Robert E. Howard wanted to convey with the barbarism and civilization kind of tension. Although it got to the point of being repeated one too many times, I do feel. I think in the early section of in the first section of the first two chapters of this short story, it's like every other paragraph is about the very I don't want to use the word barbaric, more like the wilder side of nature versus the civilized
Savage.
the savage side of. I'll use wilder. I'll stick to wilder because I don't want to give it a connotation, because I don't think Robert E. Howard wanted to make the case that one is better than the other, at least in this particular short story. I think what he wanted to convey is that there is a certain honesty to the wild side of humanity, and then the corruption that inevitably comes with civilization or something like that. It does repeat itself a little bit on that score multiple times. It also came out very clearly to me how as one of the first, if not the first, as Nikki has explained, one of the first story of its kind is definitely working out that kink in what kind of story it wants to be. I do feel because you start off with what could have been something like a historical account of a king in his court, with all the political intrigues that might occur within a court itself, and then it went to this philosophical musing on the tension between the wilder side of nature and civilization, and the corruption of civilization. And then it went to eldritch horror a la Lovecraft, because of the way he described the serpent god as being this outside force that's been like that has infiltrated humanity since time immemorial, way back in the past and stuff like that. And then it became a action fantasy with the killing of the serpent man and things like that. I think it was trying to work out what it wanted to be, and to me anyway, it does come out very strongly. They're still trying to find its identity. On a side note though, I find the setup of Kull to be a little bit unbelievable. So I don't think it was ever touched on how Kull became king of Valusia. It is implied that somebody sponsored him to be king, and I don't think I don't think he conquered. Is it Valusia or Valusia?
Valusia.
Valusia. I don't think he conquered Valusia. And the reason I don't think he did that is because he had no cohort with him. He had none of his own generals, none of his soldiers. He doesn't have any loyalists or anything like that. He apparently won the throne as an individual. Yeah. So I find that setup to be quite unbelievable, actually. And maybe it's just my own way of reading that makes it difficult for me to suspend my disbelief and all that. But we do have a historical example of a shall we say barbarian king that conquered an old civilization, and that the name of the barbarian king is Genghis Khan, and the civilization he conquered is China. And one of the things that made Genghis Khan's reign work is how he would I mean, obviously he had an army behind him, and he had his own loyalists, and he had some form of brutal enforcement that basically forced his subjects to cooperate with him. He made full use of the expertise of the people he conquered, because I don't think Kull could ever have managed to navigate the bureaucracy of Valusia on his own, without at least using the bureaucrats that already populated Valusia's court. It's just inconceivable. He would have been outfoxed and outmaneuvered at every point in his reign without some way of doing that. And I also don't think that so one of the really interesting thing about Genghis Khan is he never learned how to read, and it was his one biggest regret. He really tried to learn, but he couldn't. It was just too, I mean, we, as any adult that tried to learn a third or fourth language in their 30s or 40s will know how difficult it is, and he never managed it. But he had his loyalists enforce that particular thing, right, to help him with the reading and writing part. As I don't know where Kull got his education, but not being able to read and write the laws of the courts of Valusia, he will never have retained his throne. He would have been overthrown or made a puppet within like half a year at the most, I think. So that part of the setup makes Kull seem like an unbelievable character to me. So
I think
yes,
I think we saw him becoming a puppet during this story, actually. And I'll explain why when it's my turn.
I mean, you are right. He was manipulated at every step of the way. First with the Pict ambassador Kanam, and then
Kanu.
and then the obviously the Serpent Man. Yeah. So I mean, I think as a prototype sword and sorcery story, it's an interesting historical read, and obviously it laid the foundation for what came after. So on that note, it is a very notable story. Yeah, but just some of the setup around it just feels not yet there.
Rough around the edges.
Yes, correct. Great, thanks. Yeah, and that's my take.
Before I go onto my thoughts, do you have anything to say about what Ixri has said?
Yeah, I think the the idea that a raw barbarian type might manage to seize the throne of a rather over sophisticated, decayed society is quite plausible, because I can imagine that the politicians, exhausted by their factional maneuvers, might welcome somebody from outside as a sort of compromise candidate, to use modern political terminology, and they might each think, well, here's somebody we can maneuver, and we don't have to quarrel about precedence because he's not one of us anyway. And it all might end up with Kull getting the throne, feeling highly uncomfortable with it, but nevertheless being allowed to retain it. And
Well, I mean,
we will know.
he definitely is feeling uncomfortable. I think he exhibited signs of imposter syndrome, if I'm not wrong. If I didn't read that wrong.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. We don't know for sure, because the whole setup is described in a vaguer fashion than the setup in the Conan stories. In the Conan stories, we see the whole world much more clearly, but Valusia is kind of a bit nebulous. But still, we can make guesses.
I think actually guessing a lot of stuff is part of the fun with these old
Yeah,
stories. They have so much atmosphere, so much oozing out of them that, you know, if you really wanted to, as I will demonstrate in just a moment, dear viewers, you can really read into a lot of things and create different narratives because of the vagueness. Um, so, what did I think about the story? Well, first of all, I don't think I surprised anybody by saying that I liked it. I mean, I've liked every single Robert E. Howard story or book that we have reviewed so far. So, big whoop. I like The Shadow Kingdom. I don't like it as much as I like many other tales by Robert E. Howard. I mean, for instance, this is nowhere near God in the Ball, for me. Um, Rogues in the House holds a very special place in my heart because of its interesting style and the rhythm of the sentences and the phrases. Tower of the Elephant is probably one of the best stories about Conan and written by Robert E. Howard. So it's got a lot of competition, but what it lacks in some of the aspirations and some of the repetitions that XJ has mentioned, and with which I agree, it holds this special interest because um, if you did not guess, this story is the origin of the conspiracy theory about the snake people, about the reptilian undercover society that rules the world. So whenever you hear any of that, philosophy,
Space
you can,
lizards, yeah?
yeah, you can thank this book.
mm,
You can thank this short story. That's where it came from. This is where it is. Not only that, but H.P. Lovecraft took this idea and kept peppering it through his stories, talking about old snake people that used to rule stuff. So that's just fueled the flame. And Robert's favorite, Clark Arsham Smith, used the serpent people in Hyperborea a lot.
mm.
Um, I mean, even at the time when this was just published, this was very influential. People took the idea, really good writers at the time, right, and ran with it and inserted it into their own stories because it was interesting. And from that point, you have to understand that this whole secret society idea has always been um, at the back of anyone's mind. Why are these things happening? Why does this not make sense in my head? Well, it can only make sense if someone is, puppeteering something. If someone is pulling the strings, that's the way it works, right? And this is the golden standard of this, right? It's an ancient alien race that knows better. So it is sitting down and it's telling everybody how to do things. So just because of that, right? Just because of how well it portrays this idea. Um, Kull's story has got to be up there.
Hmm.
Now, I think, I don't know if this was the intention of the author. In fact, I suspect that it's not. I think it was more written in a, high adventure. The hero gets to destroy the serpent men, and proclaims that he is going to root them out of his kingdom. I think that was the intention. But if you read very carefully, you can trick yourself into thinking that Kull is part of a very deep conspiracy, even deeper than what is portrayed in the story, where Brule and Kuna are also both serpent men. Where this silly phrase, right, that I will now say that you know that I'm not a serpent man, Kanama ka lajirama, is utter nonsense. That people are pretending that it hurts them to say it. That all of these moments of interactions, I mean, I'll give you just one example. So this is Brule and Kull, as they're sort of like lurking in the inside the castle. Their glances met. Kull felt warmly a sense of comradeship with this member of an enemy tribe. Like rival leopards turning at bay against hunters, those two savages made common cause against the inhuman powers of antiquity. So, what are snakes famous for? Locking eyes with people and mesmerizing them. What happens a lot in the tale? Brule and Kull looking at each other, and Kull having a realization. Now, of course, again, as most of you behind the screen who have more brain capacity than others, you'd be like, these are all coincidences. This is not what the story is about. I agree. I'm not saying that it is. But what if, right? And that's what's so fun about this story. Once you introduce a situation where there is a conspiracy theory, where there is someone pulling the strings, you're inviting even more further analysis. And if you really wanted to, like I did when I was a child, I was like, Canu and Brule are in on it. They're both serpent men. And they have positioned Kull to go on this stupid adventure to go and kill more serpent men. And obviously he's not going to find anyone, because you're just gonna start asking people, say Kanama Kalir Jirma, and then they're all just gonna say it because that's silly. There's no way that somebody just couldn't say that. And the serpent people are gonna keep ruling, influencing Kull through the tribe of Picts, right? So that was the crazy idea in my head when I was a kid. And to some extent, I think I have convinced myself, even though deep down I know, well, I'm sure, actually, not that I know, but I'm sure that Robert E. Howard didn't mean it that way. This is the way I read the story each time. Each time I read it, I find more clues that probably don't exist to support this theory. And for that, it is a very enjoyable read. Each time I reread it, I feel like something interesting has transpired. Something new has been learned about the Serpentman. Or perhaps I just forget because I'm getting old and not everything stays in my head. But yes, because of this, I rate the story very highly.
Yeah, I think one of the best bits. I think there are two bits at which the story shades into real horror and suspense instead of just performative horror and suspense. I mean, I like performative stories. That is to say, like being at a good what's it called, pantomime, where you just you go along with the spirit of the thing. But there's a bit here. I'm just going to read it. Men of Valusia, he began in the conventional manner, then halted, perplexed. The councillors had risen as a man and were moving towards him. There was no hostility in their looks, but their actions were strange for a council room. The foremost was close to him when Brule sprang forwards, crouched like a leopard, and then it turns out that the councillors are serpent men. But that moment of puzzlement, I really sympathised with poor old Kull just then. It was very nightmarish. And the other great moment is when he sees what seems to be himself addressing a gathering, and he realizes he's been impersonated as he looks. That is a really good touch.
I have to agree with Robert here. Not just that section, but also meeting the soul of the ancient king that was killed.
Oh,
That
yeah.
was also a very creepy moment. Like in general, that section with the serpent people is so well conveyed that it feels like a completely and utterly different type of story from that point onwards, if you know what I mean. It's like you read this, right? It starts off as like sword and sorcery, and then it veers completely into the eldritch horror genre, and then it's done so well that it felt like a different story altogether. It's a very very odd feeling reading this story, because there are sections of it that are done so well that they could be their own thing, but then when they are put together, it's very disorienting, because it goes from one side that is really well done, and then it takes a completely different turn, and then it turns again.
Yeah,
I
you
think
can
if you were
understand why
enjoying
Kull
all,
was a brooder, more of a brooder than Conan. I mean, the things he had to put up with is enough to make anyone brood, really. Sorry,
that's true.
Nikki, you were saying, yeah.
I was saying that I think if you were a fan of all of the genres that the Robert E. Howard cycles through, um, or were not as overexposed to them as we all are, um, I think you might have this refreshing enjoyment of it. Keep switching, um, at least that's the way I felt when I first read it. Now I feel the same weariness that XJ has has said. But before, when it was just my first read through, the fact that it kept switching and flipping made me really pay attention, because I didn't know what was gonna come next. Where the story would turn, what kind of style it would be now. Um, I read all of Conan before I ever read Kull, so my impression after reading I think 3 stories that were translated into Russian, uh, it's definitely Mirrors and the Shadow Kingdom. I can't remember the third one, but anyway, um, I remember feeling like for some reason Robert couldn't write about Conan anymore, and he had to make Kull to just continue his story. That was what my head canon. And very recently, I was looking for more stuff that Robert E. Howard did, and I accidentally stumbled upon an adaptation. Well, I mean, calling it adaptation is rich. Or reimagining of Conan. It's a TV show, a cartoon for children in the 80s and 90s, called Conan the Adventurer. And listen to this premise, right? Conan lives in his little village, just like in the movie. Uh, some star metal falls from the sky. His father, a blacksmith, forges it into great weapons and sells it all across the world, keeping one for Conan. And then we find out that the Serpent Men want star metal, because it will unlock the gate so Set can invade the world or whatever. I don't really understand that part. Anyway, the Serpent Men come. They wreak havoc around the village. Conan sees his family turned to stone by Raphamon, the main villain, the serpent man, and now Conan has to go all over the world and find the serpent people and destroy them. So what those people did was they were like, you know what? We'll take the story of Kull that we never saw happen, and then we're gonna put Conan in it, right? Kind of mirroring what I thought as a child. That's very fascinating to me. I haven't watched that much of the cartoon. I mean, it's for children, um, but I've heard that some of the episodes are actually pretty well made and are interesting to watch.
They are. It was a Saturday morning cartoon for me, and I loved it.
Whoa, really? You watched it?
Yeah, I didn't watch it in sequence because I'm terrible at following broadcast, and which is why I never watched television series. Like my schedule, even since I was a kid, is not predictable. So I caught bits and pieces of it, but I enjoyed the cartoon. It was really cool, really nice, well done. I never knew that the Star Metal was not canon until I actually read the original Conan stories. I always thought Conan had Star Metal sword. Never realized it was it was made up.
It would be really fascinating to do maybe like an episode or two review of Conan
The
the
cartoon?
Adventurer and just see
Oh,
like what do we think about it.
Oh
Right, like
yeah.
you're coming from the side of the person who saw it in childhood, and Robert and I as people who who have different media understanding of Conan before this.
I want to ask you something though. How did the Russian translation of Cow hold up for you? Like you've now read both the Russian and the English versions of it.
I may be biased.
No,
Yeah,
I
no.
mean the reason why I ask is very often when you translate things, you have to make a decision on whether to sacrifice the poetry of the original language or to go for the meaning behind the language. And for me, like this question is in my mind because I was listening to a piece of music written in Mandarin, and I was just struck by how poetic the lyrics are. And then I was thinking to myself, how can I translate this to English? And I find I simply don't have the ability to do so. So, Nikki, how did the translations hold up for you?
Well, I mostly write in English. And it's probably for the best because although I can speak fluently in Russian and I can read it perfectly, and I can even write down, probably a page worth that would be somewhat coherent for an individual, I have lost some of the craft. But because I write in English and my origins of writing come from the Russian language, I struggle a lot because the Russian language is much more poetic than the English language. And a lot of the turns of phrases and the way the English language wants to work sometimes clashes with the Russian language. But I have been proven wrong because a lot of Robert E. Howard's and Clark Ashton Smith's works are written in a flowery language where they use words that are not usually used in the context that they are being used in their stories. Right? And sort of add that poetical piece to it. But it's very seldom in the current way the English literature is written. So again, I may be biased, but when I read Shadow Kingdom in Russian, I felt like it was better than this. Now I haven't read it in a long time in Russian, about 10 years. So you know what? Maybe next time we come together, I'll read it in Russian and I'll tell you whether it holds up to that. But from memory, I remember the situation being even darker, even more awe-consuming. Maybe that's why the feeling of the conspiracy within conspiracy was so strong when I read it as a kid. because it just felt so gloomy and irritable and unwinnable, the whole situation.
I think English has the use of English has undergone a kind of weird restriction in I don't know, the last couple of centuries. You might say that people like Clark Ashton Smith are unusually flowery, but the fact is, I think they've just got back to what English ought to be. And if you read the dialogue, for example, in Walter Scott's novels written in the early 19th century, not the narrative prose, which is fairly run of the mill, but the actual dialogue where the characters suddenly come alive and almost jump off the page, the way they speak, you can see that we've lost, for no good reason, we English users a tremendous amount. We choose, like men nowadays choose to wear boring suits and ties. There's the in business circles, the linguistic equivalent of that is using language in a boring way. And there's no actual rational or logical reason for that. The words are there, the inexhaustible mine of English vivid expression is still there, but for some reason people don't use it. And therefore, because they don't use it, it becomes for them outdated. Well, it's not outdated for me because I'm a reader, but that's the way it goes. And I get the way I talk, of course, gets affected by the boring way everybody else talks, which is unfortunate.
I
But
think
there you go.
I think English had become a lot more functional over time, and so
Yeah,
it's
which means
more, yes, which loses a lot of the charm. Like when I'm reading something that was written even, I don't know, 80, 90 years ago, like Sherlock Holmes or any of the weird tales that we have read, the prose is definitely a lot more flowery and atmospheric than if I were reading something more modern, I suppose. Yeah.
maybe flowery is not the right word. I would say vivid.
Elegant? Vivid?
Viscous.
Maybe, yeah.
Viscous.
Something-
Oh,
yeah.
I don't know if that's the right imagery for that, Nikki.
Well, it's my artistic vision. So
Okay,
it's viscous.
sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think just to expand on, well, not really expand because I don't know any Russian at all, but to take off a tangent on Nikki's comparison between Russian and English. For me, what I find difficult about translating Mandarin to English is Mandarin is a very compact language. It's I'm struggling to explain it. It's
Concise.
packed with meaning. It's you squeeze a lot of imagery and a lot of meaning and a lot of historical cultural context into a few words. And so when it's like a zip file, so when you want to unpack it in English to get the full meaning, it will have to be like a complete paragraph just to describe four words in Chinese. Or you try to go for the feel and the atmosphere of it and then completely lose the meaning in the process. That is a chief difficulty with well written Mandarin, very classical Mandarin, I would say. Yeah.
Could you give an example for both us and the viewers?
So
Something that, yeah.
So the song that really prompted all this is I think it's called 界王, which is the original soundtrack for Black Myth Wukong, a game that's going to come out next year.
In respect for the Chinese language, I will not attempt to say the
Fair
words
enough.
you just did.
Fair enough. So one line just kept circling in my head, and I'm just like super impressed with just how much meaning there is, and it is let's see, 管他虚情假意，花落水自流。And it's so this song is sang by a duet, a man and a woman. This particular line is sang by the woman, and it's very very so. The first part of the phrase, it basically translates to, it doesn't matter if there is no sincerity in your love. The second part of the sentence is when the flower has fallen, it will flow with the river. And that is there are multiple ways of, I don't even know if my interpretation of it is the right one. There are multiple ways of interpreting that particular sentence, particularly in context with the first phrase, right? It's like taken together, it could mean it doesn't matter if you the man, your love is not real. I have fallen, and the river will bring me to wherever it wants to go. Like, it's like the woman is basically saying, like, it doesn't matter if your love is not real, because for me it is, and I will and it is I have no choice but to follow this, to go along with this flow. And I was thinking to myself, how can I translate that in English in a very elegant way? And I'm like, particularly in a song, and I'm like, you know what? I don't have the ability to do so.
It does sound like a tall order. I think if you sat down with someone who is a linguist genius of the
Yeah.
English language and truly knows it, maybe they could find a way, but I don't think it would be an easy job at all.
No, it's
Right?
maybe if a person who writes poetry for a living could do that, but it's certainly not me.
I think you'd also want to have an expert who understands Chinese perfectly and can speak English. So they
Yeah.
could speak with this lexical individual to try, they would have to put their heads together.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. And I don't know, man. It's like the second part of the sentence is just such a beautiful visual imagery for me, and a description of a very subtle but also very deep way of describing a certain emotional mindset without actually spelling it out, you know. Yeah. Anyway,
And
tangent.
another passage, yeah, no problem. Another passage from the tale that I think really gives a visage of something truly horrific was this. After the imposter of the counselor is slain, hesitantly, Kull set his hand to the hilt. His flesh crawled as he set his foot upon the terror which lay at their feet, and as some jerk of muscular reaction caused the frightful mouth to gape suddenly, he recoiled, weak with nausea. Then, wrathful at himself, he plucked forth his sword and gazed more closely at the nameless thing that had been known as Tu, chief counselor. Save for the reptilian head, the thing was the exact counterpart of a man. As well, the image of a serpent person, like a person with a face of a snake, is something that we have seen in so many things since. But imagine reading this in 1929, right? And you get to this, part, and you get the description of the faces of the snake people and how they're basically exactly like you, but not the same. I think cleverly so, it actually sort of plays a lot on on the current worries at that time in 1929, the imposter syndrome of the American people, with so many foreigners coming in and them not really understanding who is here and what are they going to do, right? Uh, Playing on that concept must have been at least somewhat conscious when it comes to Robert E. Howard's decision, right? Something that would be in the forefront of his thoughts. Whether whether or not there was any other meaning behind it, I still think that it was an influence. And you can see it in a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's work as well. The fear of the other, right, being pushed at the forefront, the psychological issue that humanity has had for since the dawn of time. I mean, the Neanderthals didn't kill themselves.
Yeah. Of course, a lot of people would have their looks improved by being given a serpent's head, but
I mean, you're not wrong. And it must be, right? This is another thing that really gives me the feeling that there must be a setup somehow, and Robert E. Howard must be hinting at something, because the priests of the Snake Men in the fake throne room put basically no resistance. The characters talk about it in character. They're like, yeah, if these guys knew how to fight, we'd be dead, but they didn't know how to fight. And it's like, what are you trying to show us here? Are you trying to instill that there's something more going on? Or, is this just like trying to showcase Kull's and Brule's savagery, how they are unrelenting? In any case, the end of the story sees Brule as the right hand of the king and Kanu being able to influence whatever Kull says. Kull is unconscious on the ground, and the Picts are basically ruling Valusia from then on. Think back to the Mirrors of Thuzon Thun. The whole story is about Kull losing identity, and then the thing that brings him back is Brule. He's like, I saved you in the last moment. And recontextualizing it with this first tale, you could be like, the Picts didn't want to lose their investment. They wanted Kull back on the throne, so Brule came in at the last second to save him. And Kull sees this as a good friend who has saved them, and it was Brule's job to do because the influence of his people would have otherwise fallen.
But it could be all for the best,
See, when I first read The Mirrors of Thuzon Thun, I actually thought Brule was part of Kull's conquering army that took over Valusia. And it's like, then reading this, I'm like, clearly, I don't think we'll ever know how Kull got his throne, but it's very clear after reading these two stories that Kull is probably not that great a king.
Well, he stood as an independent, you see.
People were fed up and they just voted for him just to be contrarian. That's right. Look, why don't we further recontextualize both of those stories by remembering the Beyond the Black River, where the Picts are once again at the forefront of the story. So it looks like their strategy was, let's keep the civilized players, the civilized countries around us at bay by semi-controlling them and pushing them for our agendas. And it seems that this has ended with Aquilonia. Like their influence on civilization faltered, and they came back to use the savage ways, right? To get the sorcerer who could control savage beasts and to attack Aquilonia, right? And free their own lands. So it's very interesting. You can see the world building. Sorry, go on.
Interesting. I mean, that's a very interesting take, to be honest. That is not how historically what barbarian tribes matter to older, more established civilizations, because they tend to be forces nibbling at the edges of these nations, like in Rome with Attila the Hun and Hannibal, and of course Genghis Khan, and all the various tribal forces that keep eating away at China. Feels, the way you described it feels, if I can use it, the perception of Jews in medieval Europe, to be honest.
Well, you have to understand that Robert E. Howard writes barbaric tribes, very differently to what they actually were in history. They are savage but wise, right? They are strong as a ferocious wind that will, destroy anything in their path, but they also hold ancient secrets. Beyond the Black River, right? You've got that ancient man who is able to use spells and powers that civilization has lost. This trope is used a lot in fantasy, where a more backward society is somehow more in intrinsic with either nature or magic, or when something keeps progressing, like civilization and Conan. The older generations, the older tribes, they hold on to more powerful knowledge, right? Where in the real world it's the reverse. The more you learn as a society, the more advanced you become, the more things open up, right? Like the Romans came up with aqueducts, not the Mongolians. Let's put it like that.
I mean, I go back to Genghis Khan. It's not as if Genghis Khan is an unsophisticated savage. He ruled China for quite a number of years effectively, and he also established a dynasty that lasted for a pretty long time. And actually, a lot of the dynasties in China they used to be barbarian tribes, and they usually last for 200-300 years, so they are not at all unsophisticated. What I'm trying to say is that usually they don't play political games like setting one country against another. Most of the time they go in, they see, they conquer, they like what they see.
I don't know. I think on a very small level, the level that is not recorded by history, there was a lot of that going on between tribes. One tribe undermining another so that they fight with their foe by throwing the spear with the right symbol into the no man's land or whatever. I'm sure those situations did transpire.
For sure. I mean, for sure. It's just usually it's a bit harder to play bigger countries like that off each other without having access to the office, so to speak. But we digress.
Yeah, what Brule's tribe does have, what the Picts do have, is magic and wisdom. That is a big, powerful weapon, right? Because this whole wisdom and knowledge is, if you believe the first, like the tale is proper, if you're just reading it without getting into it, they managed as a tribe to find out the plot of these snake men, inform the king, stop it, know the passageways of the palace. They're very sophisticated, even though they're a tribe, right? And if you believe the sub, like the little seed of doubt that I've been trying to push on you, if you believe that they are serpent men, then this becomes even easier to comprehend. Well, obviously the Picts are also infiltrated by the serpent men, and it's all just an elaborate plot.
I mean, it's not that difficult to imagine, because in the Black River, the Picts, they use some form of black magic where they have contracts, so to speak, with eldritch horrors. Am I right? So yeah, they could have had magic that is drawn in some form from the Serpent Man. So, but I think at this particular point in time with Robert E. Howard, he hasn't really fully established out of this yet, and the raw form is still very much a raw form, and you can, or at least it comes out to me very clearly that this is the prototype.
Well, it was published in August, and we're recording this in August, right? August 1929. I mean, we're not recording in 1929, but we're recording in August. And the originally published Beyond the Black River was 6 years later, in May 1935. So 6 years after all of what had transpired here, right? Like, and all of the other stories that Robert E. Howard wrote, you have the Picts making their big appearance in the Conan stories. So you have to wonder, had he thought about the Shadow Kingdom when he was writing Beyond the Black River, right? Like, was he in any way, shape, or form influenced by ideas that were brewing in his mind?
Yeah.
Well, all very delicious food for thought. And with that said, we're coming up to an hour. I hate to be that guy, but do we have any last words on the Shadow Kingdom?
Shadow Kingdom is a great story. It's sad that such high concept was turned into a conspiracy theory, which everybody talks about, and it's just like, the craziest idea ever. So just for being so influential, it can't be lower than an 8. And because of my love for Robert E. Howard and the genre, it can't be lower than 9. So I guess it's 9. 9 out of 10.
Yeah. I might give it just 1/2 a point less than that, not because it's not a great story, but because the actual setting is not as, shall we say, crisp in a way as it later becomes in the Conan stories. I wish that Valusia was more real to me than it is, but still, 8.5 is a blooming good score.
It's very
pretty low for
it's
you,
more than
Mr. 10 out of
respectable.
10.
It's more than
Yeah.
respectable.
And
Comparatively
I'd like to
to
know,
your usual scoring, it's pretty low, to be honest.
well, I'd just like to know if there are serpent men. I'd like to have some other means of identifying them rather than just sticking a sword into them. Because supposing you think somebody's a serpent man and he turns out not to be, it's a kind of a bit late after you've stuck a sword in. You'd have to say, "Oops," sorry.
What's
But
great
anyway,
about the cartoon version of this whole story is the fact that the Serpent Men turn into Serpent Men when they're close to Star Metal.
well, that would be a way of doing it. Yes, that would solve the problem. Yeah.
I mean, they did have like 50 years of foresight. So if somebody could just come up to Robert E. Howard and tell him about Star Metal like 50 years before that.
Well,
Oh well.
Star Metal solves a lot of things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, actually, what is your score?
I will give it a 7 for historical significance and the fact that it is a diamond in the making. You can clearly see the promise.
That's quite high for you, XJ. 7. Pretty good.
What's again? Correct. Why? All right. So with before the jaws of this Mortal Kombat are opened, I think we should close up the podcast.
Yes. Well, all right. for our listeners out there, if there's anything you think we can improve in our podcast, please put in the comment section below. And with that, have a great day, evening, whatever time it is it might be for you when you listen to the podcast. Take care.